What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run 2 programs called Inner Knowing and Good Life Designed for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals on tools and frameworks for creating an intuitive practice and for creating self-mastery in their life. As someone who's helped countless entrepreneurs open doors of possibility that they never thought existed, I've seen these strategies transform people's lives. The best part is that you'll 10x your output, unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly to overcome your limiting beliefs. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition, and set a new framework on how to live your best life. And you'll get access to guided meditations that I have personally created that are not available anywhere else. We'll create a new self-concept that you can practice moving forward. This method is so effective that even if you don't have a lot of time or if you think you're not ready for a change, these frameworks and methodologies will still work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can also check out what some of the previous clients had to say about our time together. It's first come, first serve, and I hope to see you there. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, spirituality, and consciousness. On today's episode, I speak with Dawson Church PhD. He's an award-winning science writer with 3 best-selling books to his credit. The Genie in Your Genes was the first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression. Mind to Matter showed that the brain creates much of what we think of as objective reality, which we'll talk about in the show. And Bliss Brain demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Dr. Church did his undergraduate and graduate work at Baylor University, and he also obtained his doctorate at Holos University under the supervision of Harvard-trained neurosurgeon Norm Shealey, MD, PhD, and the founder of the American Holistic Medical Association. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dawson.
Yasmin, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Dawson, to kick it off, you say that there is a middle ground to the idea that thoughts become things. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, and there are obvious ways in which thoughts cannot become things. Like, I can't look out of the window of my office here and have the thought, gee, I'd like to have a $75 million super yacht in my backyard, and one appears in my backyard. That sort of thing is clearly impossible. And there are people who say that with thought, all things are possible, and there are limits. And they're pretty obvious. I mean, there are limits to what we can do. So, and those absurd limits really aren't there. But also, between the mundane, I want a drink of water, and I go to the sink and fill up a cup, that I can manifest. I can't manifest the super yacht, but the middle ground of what we can manifest is actually quite large. We're manifesting, for example, molecules in our bodies all the time. With a single negative thought, I can create cortisol. With a single positive thought, I can create oxytocin, DHEA, and other hormones and neurotransmitters. And so our minds are creating things like molecules all the time. And then they're also creating molecules outside our bodies. For example, research shows that when you have healing intentions and you hold that glass of water, that those healing intentions actually change the molecular bonds between the hydrogen and oxygen atoms. So all kinds of things are shifting outside of our bodies as well as inside, based simply on the content of our minds.
So can we break that down, Dawson? Why are our thoughts so important? I want to really walk through kind of like the sequence of events that happens with our thoughts, because I think a lot of people are pretty confused, and I think a lot of us spend most of our day in repetitive thoughts, right? So yeah, can you tell us why are our thoughts so important?
Our thoughts are repetitive, and our brains developed over the course of evolution to have repetitive thoughts for a really good reason. And so, if you can just imagine if you sat down to tie your shoelaces and try to figure it out for the first time, like it was the first time every time, or you picked up a fork and had to figure out each time how to stick it into a piece of broccoli. So you want to have brain that functions on autopilot most of the time for most things. And that's really useful. And the trouble is that most of us have set up autopilot for all kinds of rumination, reflection that doesn't serve us. And when we look, for example, at people's levels of cortisol, they're often really high. People are living in you look at their cortisol, look at their brain scans, they look like they're living in the jungle, even though they have every possible material advantage. So, what we have tended to do is develop ways of being with the world that are stressful, where we're generating far too much negative brainwave activity. We're scanning the horizon for stuff that's wrong, which, again, for your ancestor 100,000 years ago, it was totally adaptive. And it was a survival skill, essential survival skill, to scan the horizon looking for the tiger in the grass or the snake in the tree limb. But that kind of hypervigilance now means we apply those survival skills to looking for, funny example. My daughter was back recently visiting me, and she's in her 20s, and she had a pimple. And she talked about this pimple several times a day. She was obsessed with this pimple. And here she is, this wonderful young human being, just brilliant, accomplished. And when she looks at herself in the mirror, all she sees is a pimple. And so we're used to seeing the pimple in our finances, in our partners, in our jobs, in our societies, where we hunt obsessively for what's wrong. And we deprive ourselves of the glory, of the majesty, of the magnificence, of the awe of how much is right in ourselves and in our worlds all the time. So that negativity bias that served our ancestors so well is driving our cortisol up, is producing that repetitive negative thinking, is making that routine, and that in turn is triggering diseases like Alzheimer's. Stunning 2020 study showed that people with amyloid and tau tangles and plaques in their brains, that was triggered. The primary factor triggering that was thought. Repetitive negative thinking was literally producing greater numbers of these plaques, these Alzheimer's plaques in our brains. And the more repetitive negative thinking people did, the greater the amount of plaque deposited and the more rapid the progression of Alzheimer's. So there are lots of studies now directly linking our thoughts to those molecules, our life outcomes, our health, and the world around us.
So it's so interesting that, we do look for what's wrong. And so what are ways, and maybe you have some suggestions or tools or ways that you have implemented your own way to kind of move through the world without focusing on negative thoughts? Like, how do you sort of work with that?
It is really hard to change, Yasmin. It is really hard to shift that pattern because it's built into us over the course of millions of years of evolution. And so, how do you change it? And back along the road 2,500 years ago, the Buddha said meditation. Meditation is the way. So, in Hinduism and Buddhism and Eastern religions, they developed meditation. And then Christianity, Judaism had other ways of doing it. One of those was to read the words and focus on the lives of extraordinary people, of mystics, of saints. So there have been various ways of us trying to shift this. And then along came psychology, 1850, 1870 in Germany and England and other parts of Europe. You found these big movements in psychology. And we tried Freud's talking cure. We tried behavioral psychology, cognitive therapies in the 1960s and 70s. And so we've evolved these strategies to try and shift this. But it is really hard. Like, just think about a habit you've tried to change, and you've tried to change this habit so long. You've been to all these workshops and studied with these teachers and read these books, and the darn habit just persists. So it's hard to change our conditioning. And so there are things you can do to break it. But again, they are difficult, they require focus. And so the easiest ones I've found are a science-based meditation. And by science-based, I mean evidence-based. And a lot of forms of meditation aren't that effective and aren't based in what we now know is the best neuroscience. But there are a few forms of meditation that really work. And so if you use those, you can start to break those patterns. The other one I use is acupressure. And it turns out that pressure on acupuncture points, tapping on them with your fingertips, rapidly interrupts old patterns. And at my nonprofit, the Veteran Stress Solution, we have now worked with over 22,000 veterans over the last decade, offering them free treatment for PTSD. So they're coming to us, and PTSD, there is extreme repetitive negative thinking. And that's taking the form of flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and all these other symptoms of PTSD. And we work with these PTSD sufferers, and they're telling us, well, I'll give you one little audio example. So one young man I was doing an EFT session with, we were in a TV studio, and we were being filmed, and I was doing EFT with him. And you can't see this, but you can probably hear this and guess what it is.
Ooh,
I'm
yeah.
crinkling a plastic water bottle. This disposable water bottle. I crinkle it like that. So someone in the TV studio did this, and this young man who served in Iraq was ready to dive under the table because his brain is interpreting that as gunfire. And so many of our PTSD sufferers are getting triggered by people looking at them, being in public places, all of these cues from the outside. And so we've now worked with over 22,000 people suffering from PTSD free of charge. We've done 7 randomized controlled trials and a meta-analysis, and we found that using acupressure, just pressure, tapping on acupuncture points while they think about the gunfire in Iraq, while they think about the dead bodies, while they think about civilians being killed, while they think about all the horrors of war, breaks that move of their brain into fight or flight in 6 1-hour sessions. That's all it takes, 6 sessions, and they walk out of there and all of those symptoms are gone. So acupressure, energy therapies, body-based therapies are really effective at doing this. That breaks the cycle. And then once you've broken the cycle, done the EFT, the tapping, the acupressure, you then need to move to elevated states in meditation. So we find those two things, these acupressure-based therapies and meditation, are really the way to start to shift those old evolutionary patterns, and your brain changes really, really quickly. You can just go look on YouTube, type in neuroplastic brain change, and you'll see that there are real-time micro photographs there from electron microscopes. And like in Bliss Brain, in my book Bliss Brain, I have images from an electron microscope, and you see 2 neurons, and they're kind of twitching, and they're far apart, then they move together, and then they literally like shake hands and connect. And the whole thing takes 12 seconds, Yasmin. So every 12 seconds, we're literally able to start forming new connections. Now you start to rewire your brain and you become more resilient, you become more creative, all kinds of good things start to happen. So evolution equipped us with these brains that are hyper vigilant and sensitive to all these environmental cues of threat. With tapping, acupressure, meditation, tools like that, we can shift them. Can we shift them in a few days? Probably not. But can we shift them in a month, 2 months, 6 months? Definitely.
Wow. So I want to talk about EFT a little bit later and specifically like some of the points. Maybe you can give us one exercise for folks listening to do towards the end. So I'd like to also talk about the science behind the creative function of the mind, right? Because like there's PTSD and dealing with negative thoughts, but I think people are also probably curious, like how do they stimulate more creative, inspirational, innovative thoughts as well?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And it's actually linked to PTSD because in my book, Bliss Brain, I have a whole chapter on this phenomenon called post traumatic growth. And we pay so much attention to PTSD, which is a very real problem, which I spent a lot of time and a lot of research effort in solving. But the research, the data shows that when people are confronted with a life-shattering experience, about a third of people go on to develop PTSD, but 2/3 actually don't. And many of those people use trauma as a springboard to personal growth. And what happens if you are able to do this, if you have the resources to do this, is sure, you are shattered initially. You do have the same trauma responses that a person who gets permanently traumatized will have, but you're able to put it in a framework. Somebody who say lived through a tragedy, a disaster, says at a certain point, well, like one woman, for example, I worked with her at a live workshop, and at the end of that, this is before the pandemic, we were in a big auditorium. She was on stage with me, and she'd been molested between the ages of 2 and 15. So she had this long period of abuse in her life. And she was a therapist. She'd done a lot of therapy, but she couldn't quite break out of it. And so I was using EFT with her. We did an intensive session in front of a big audience. And afterwards, she stood up and she looked at the whole audience. She said, "Nothing that man could do between the ages of 2 and 15, nothing that man could do to me could take away my joy. I was joyful underneath it. I'm joyful now. Underneath it, then I was joyful as well. Now I've regained I found myself. I can stand here and say, I'm joyful today. And nothing that man did to me could take away my joy." So here she's turned this shattering, absolutely horrendous experience into a story of victory and triumph and overcoming. And that's what many people can do. They're able to do that. They're able to find the tools that allow post-traumatic growth. Then what starts to happen is they're resilient. So now bad stuff happens. The economy happens and the election happens, and there might be a war, there might be a flood, there might be a weather event, there might be an earthquake. But this is a human being who's resilient because they've grown those circuits in their brain. Every 12 seconds, again, these neural bundles are connecting. In 1 hour, the number of connections in a neural bundle, a neural circuit in your brain, can double. This work won a researcher called Eric Kandel the Nobel Prize in 2000. Just brilliant work showing that in 1 hour of repeat stimulation, the number of neurons in the bundle can double. So now we're growing the neurons that make us resilient. We're growing the neurons that make us happy. And in a randomized controlled trial I did, I had people doing this method called eco-meditation, again, based in 5 evidence-based scientific methods. Super simple, but again, proven in scientific studies. And in just 1 month, 22 minutes a day, they had anatomical changes measurable on an MRI in their brains. So I don't want to go too fast here because this is a stunning finding. In just a month and only 22 minutes a day, you can literally start to restructure your brain, rewire your brain's wiring together, these circuits of positivity and joy, and it's pruning the ones that are fear-based. Our brains do a lot of pruning as well as wiring. And within 1 month, we can detect those anatomical changes on the MRI. So it's powerful to do this, and that's what makes you resilient. When you aren't just a resilient you aren't just resilient as a occasional state. You are resilient as a long-term personality trait.
Mm. So it's called eco meditation. How does that work?
Eco meditation. I am a terrible meditator. I learned to meditate on a spiritual community when I was 15 years old, and I never been able to do it very easily or effectively. So I worked with some colleagues in like around 2008, 2009, and we figured out a way of stacking EFT tapping and heart coherence from heart math, like the quick coherence technique, and mindfulness and self-hypnosis and neurofeedback, biofeedback into a group of practices that people do. And it takes about 5 minutes. And suddenly, without any attempt to still the mind, without any belief, any religion, any teacher, any guru, most people drop into a really deep, relaxed, but alert state. And so doing eco meditation is what changes brain function and helps us shift very quickly and starts to remodel the brain.
Wow, fascinating. I have your book on EFT in front of me as well, and I've just been so interested in how that particular practice will can shift so much in the brain. But I can imagine that taking all these modalities together would just be a supercharged way of really tapping into the operating system of the mind body connection. So Dawson, can you talk about how energy builds up matter? Because I think a lot of people listening probably don't understand that.
Yeah, so energy, if you think of Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, energy, E is on one side of the equal sign, matter, is on the other side of the equal sign. So energy and matter, and they have a relationship. And we think in terms of matter, especially in healing. People get sick, people get an autoimmune disease, people get a chronic condition, and they go to the doctor and say, I want a pill, or is there surgery available? And we're so used to looking at matter, and we may need a material cure or a healing method like that, intervention like that, but there is so much we can do with energy. And what we in research, we have these amazing new tools like high resolution MRIs, high resolution EEGs, and we can see what's going on in the brain. And when people use energy therapies, they change their energy, then we see shifts in these kinds of readings from their brains. For example, when people are afraid, when they're fearful, when they're emotionally aroused, when they have any kind of negative emotion going on, the emotional center of the brain, the limbic system, the midbrain, is highly active, and you see this on an EEG or an MRI. So the energy going on in the brain, the energy patterns, energy flows in the brain look like fear, look like emotional hyperarousal. When you then tap, then you're applying pressure to these acupuncture points. Again, a purely energy shift, but that balances the energy in the body, and then that energy signature in the brain of stress with that hyper aroused limbic system, midbrain, emotional brain, that just goes away. And it goes away in a few seconds usually. So these energy therapies, and again, there are lots of them. Qigong is one, Reiki is one, Jōrei. There are a lot of different flavors of energy therapies, and they're able to rapidly shift the body. Another example, I did a clinical trial looking at cortisol in 2012, published in 2012. And it was a triple blind, randomized controlled trial. We had one group getting 1 hour of EFT, a second group getting 1 hour of talk therapy, and a third group rested in a clinic. This was a 5-site study, so a very elaborate, large-scale study in 5 different locations. And we found that anxiety and depression dropped twice as much in the EFT group as the talk therapy group. Now, again, we're not doing any kind of therapy. All we're doing is shifting energy using acupuncture meridian points. We're tapping on these points that changes the energy flows in the body. And their cortisol dropped dramatically, again, almost twice as much as in the talk therapy group. So literally, molecules are changing when we shift people's energy.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Amazing. So, how about the way our emotions influence our environment? How does that work?
Our emotions are influential. Our thoughts are influential. If you have a thought backed by strong emotion, that is much more influential on your body because your body uses emotion to learn. Like pleasure teaches you. We release neurochemicals during pleasure that reinforce our seeking pleasure. That's why fentanyl is addictive. Opioids are addictive because people want more once they've experienced that molecular high. And so we want that pleasure. We also have learning molecules that make us want to avoid pain. And so there are things we do, they cause pain, and there are molecules that train us to avoid that pain in the future. So we're learning all the time as we have these experiences in our environment. When we shift our reality field, say you learn to meditate, you learn to tap, you release a lot of your psychological trauma, entering these elevated emotional states, you are what um, what you can think of as you are and you have emotional the phrase we use sounds weird after the pandemic, but this term was invented a long time before the pandemic. This field of science is called emotional contagion, and it got going when a group of researchers applied the same methods that we use to study pandemics to emotions. And they found that emotions are influential. In one famous experiment, the researchers tweaked the Facebook feeds of people to be slightly more positive or slightly more negative. Not a big tweak, just a few words, one way or the other. Within couple of weeks, those people, that small number of people on Facebook, had produced emotional contagion in 600,000 other people. So those emotions are contagious on social media. They're contagious. I mean, think about in the U.S. A recent example is the Iraq War. in 2000, nobody wanted to invade Iraq. And even after the Twin Towers September 11th tragedy, still no one wanted to invade Iraq. And it was really hard for President Bush to convince convince Congress to go to war. And then gradually there was emotional contagion. More people were willing to do it. A really hideous example is the Nuremberg rallies of 1931 and 1932 in Germany, when Hitler would have 100,000 people in a stadium shouting, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. And suddenly the whole country suffered emotional contagion and was ready for war. So there are the emotions are contagious. Now, negative ones are contagious. The impulse for war, racial prejudice, social inequality, those emotions are contagious. But positive emotions, kindness, happiness. I wrote a blog right after the pandemic began called The Pandemic of Compassion. And I wrote about how all over the world, after the pandemic began, within a few weeks, few days actually, all kinds of projects just spontaneously occurred all over the world. I looked at things happening in Iran and Australia and Canada. In Canada, there's all this fear mongering going on about the virus, and so Canadians invented a new word, and that word was caremongering. They made sure old people had food and got groceries in their homes. They took care of the needy. There was this massive uh, outpouring of altruism linked to the pandemic. So we think about all the problems of our world, and I'm not in any way denying them. But we also are beings of compassion, we're beings of love, we're beings of kindness. And I look for that evidence. And it turns out if you look for it, there's a massive amount of emotional contagion going on in a positive way. So yes, there's negative emotional contagion, war, and worry about things going on in the world. But I just plan to be, for the rest of my life, however long it lasts, an element and an agent for positive emotional contagion. And I want to be with people and have them hang out with me and hang out with people in my community. And I want everyone to get happier and happier and happier. It doesn't mean that we don't are going to deny all the bad stuff going on. It just means we're making that fundamental choice to make ourselves aware of all the well-being, all the gratitude, all the positive news going on, and then that spreads. In a long-standing study started in the 1950s called the Framing of Heart Study, the researchers have found that goodwill and kindness actually affect the people around you. So your neighbor is more likely to be happy if you're happy, about 35% more likely to be happy, quite a big percentage. And her neighbor is 15% more likely to be happy. And his neighbor, who you don't even know, is 6% more likely to be happy. So 3 degrees away, you are producing happiness when you're happy. Just your act of happiness, just your being joyful, your being full of awe and gratitude for breath, for life, for food, for the blessings of having a body. Your being in this elevated state is automatically producing emotional contagion all around you and going out who knows where. So yes, there's a negative emotional contagion. There is positive emotional contagion, and these things are both there. And we have a choice. Are we going to use our consciousness in a way that supports positivity and kindness and compassion? Or are we going to get sucked into this sort of mass hysteria that's always available? And we can just say no and make a different choice.
Amazing. That's so beautiful. And what a reminder that our emotions are really, they are infectious around us, for lack of a better word. And I think that, I've noticed that if I'm in let's say a bad mood, I wouldn't actually put myself in a public place. I would actually try to regulate myself first before going out into public, or I'd meditate or dance or do qigong. And it's so interesting because I think a lot of people, we tend to go outwards to even if we're in a bad place. And I think that it really is our responsibility to listen and be thoughtful about how we're showing up in rooms and places and spaces. So
Love yourself, be compassionate on yourself when you're in that space. I'm so glad you do know how to correct yourself, Yasmin. You're doing something proactive to do that. And you're not inflicting your bad mood on people around you. You're realizing it's you, not the world. You're correcting yourself, and then you're able to influence the world. That's a beautiful way to approach it.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Dawson, I want to understand how energy regulates our DNA and the cells of our bodies.
One remarkable experiment was done by a therapist in Florida called Beth Maharaj, and she did a gene test with people before and after an EFT session. And she found that after a 1 hour EFT tapping session, that 72 genes were significantly upregulated. Their action was dialed up. Genes that code for protection against breast cancer, prostate cancer, throat cancer, and intestinal cancer. She found that genes that are responsible for tuning our body's metabolism were dialed up. She found that genes that are responsible for increasing the insulation around the neurons in our memory and learning centers were dialed up. Genes that protect against the sun's ultraviolet rays were dialed up. Fertility genes were dialed up. All kinds of genes, 72 genes dialed up by 1 hour of EFT. Another study I did with veterans with PTSD, we gave them 10 1 hour sessions, after which their genes for immunity were dialed up. Their genes for suppressing inflammation were dialed up. So we're literally changing genes in our body through our energy fields, through our thoughts, and through our emotions.
Fascinating. And her name is Beth Maharaj?
Maharaj. Yeah,
Maharaj.
we'll look up the study. It's just Maharaj, and you can find it on our website. There are. If you just go to research.eftuniverse.com. So EFT Universe is my website. Research.eftuniverse.com is the research link to all the studies. And you'll find EEG studies there, MRI studies, studies of physical conditions like diabetes and fibromyalgia, chronic pain. There's just a remarkable, I mean, there are hundreds of studies on that site.
Amazing. And so, Dawson, when you're experiencing, let's say, a negative thought or you have pain in the body, do you immediately just do an EFT, acupressure practice?
Yeah, I have to say that I have a lot less of all those things. And then sometimes I do just, I'll be triggered by something at work, something around me, something in my family. And I use mindfulness, I use EFT, and I use meditation. And like a few weeks ago, I just had a bad day. I have no idea why. I was just miserable and depressed that day, and out of the blue. I so rarely feel that way, so it was kind of shocking that there was no reason for it. It was just there, and so I just had a quiet day. I kind of self isolated. I read, I meditated, I tapped, and I was able to correct myself and come back strong the next day. And you find also that those negative times, negative moods don't last all that long. You do have them. Sometimes they're triggered by your biorhythms, sometimes they're triggered by external events. But if you have these tools, then you can apply them. And even if you do have a day that's less than optimal, for one thing, you start to have a lot more optimal days. Because what is under recognized is that all of the research that flow researchers have been doing for the last 50 years, Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi and that whole tribe of flow researchers, the brain waves that flow produces look just like the brain waves that deep meditation produces. And so you're in flow. And so you start to have a lot more flow in your life. Is your life perfect? No. If there's a tornado that tears through your town, you're still going to get affected. So it's not like there's some kind of magic wand that happens, you have a perfect life. But again, you're resilient and you have the internal skills to cope even with those difficulties.
Yeah, I love that so much. And so I want to talk a little bit about EFT, and we can go back to some of the other questions about consciousness, because I want to understand the process. Could you give us maybe a easier example for folks listening in, how we can, maybe some of the one or two acupressure points that release stress, or perhaps could just be useful for our everyday life?
Yeah, the basic EFT routine uses 7 essential points, which are on the end points of acupuncture meridians. And so you can just tap on those. If you go to my website, you can download a free EFT mini manual, look at the diagram in the back, and you'll see lots of videos too of people tapping. Just follow along with them. And there's one point in particular that I emphasize, and that's on the small intestine meridian. And if you just look at your hand and then take three fingers of the other hand and tap just below your little finger on the side of your palm, that is the correction point for any kind of persistent energy imbalance in your body. And just tapping there can be a powerful release. And then tapping on your heart, another great spot on your central meridian, can quickly help you shift. So there's a little routine. It takes about 2 minutes to do. There's some eye movements involved. There are tapping on these points. But as you do that, you very quickly shift. And we're not talking about just Westerners with say worry about the economy. We've done humanitarian projects with orphans in Rwanda whose parents were slaughtered during the 1994 genocide. We've done a lot of work with orphans in Haiti who lost their parents in the big Haiti earthquake in 2010. So we've worked with people in countries where there are very few resources, and we've seen people who are severely impacted by trauma just recover using EFT. Is it good for trauma? It's good for trauma. It's also good for small things. If you're worried, I had a wonderful experience recently where this woman in a workshop stood up and said, Dawson, I don't have a big story for you. I'm not going to tell you I recovered from fibromyalgia as the woman who just spoke before me did. I haven't recovered from cancer. It's not nothing big. She said, but I have had low-level anxiety for 50 years. My whole life I've had just this uneasy feeling that something bad was about to happen. I've had this my whole life long, and it's gone. So sometimes it's the big stuff, sometimes it's the small stuff, but EFT really helps us shift and move into this state of equilibrium.
Wow. That is so awesome. I've heard great stories about EFT and have also practiced a little bit myself. So I'm excited to dive in a little bit more. What about in terms of your perspective on reality? To take it back to some of the earlier questions, do you believe that our reality is truly subjective? And I mean, what has been your experience, of people being able to kind of shift their realities and understand like how much their thoughts and emotions and consciousness actually shifts the external world.
In Mind to Matter, I trace every single link in the chain between thought and thing, both inside and outside the body. And so there's really good evidence for that. In fact, when I began writing the book, I knew I'd find some evidence for that. I had no idea I'd wind up with a whole bunch of bulletproof evidence, far more than I'd put in one book. And then I wrote Bliss Brain after that because I wanted to explain these extraordinary states that people get into. And so to take a step back to the earlier part of your question, we are consciousness. The great Jesuit philosopher of the 1950s, Teilhard de Chardin, said we are spiritual beings on a human path. And he coined this term, the noosphere, or the psychosphere, as some philosophers call it, the sum of consciousness on Earth. And so we're more than the sum of consciousness on Earth. There's consciousness as the structure and foundation of the universe. The universe is a conscious universe. In my book, Mind to Matter, I talk about the four forces of physics and the remarkable experiments showing that all four forces of physics are affected by something. So there's some other force that underlies and affects and can shape all four forces of physics. Just one of those, for example, is electromagnetism. And electromagnetism should be constant. If you have a monitor in a room, it should have about the same value all day, every day. These things don't change a lot. They change, they fluctuate a little bit based on sunspots and other things, but they don't change a whole lot. In one study done with a healer friend of mine, he was working on healing mice with cancer. And these mice were in a cage in one laboratory in one building in university. And under the cage, there was a device measuring the electromagnetic field of the room that the mouse's cage were in. There was a second control cage of mice in a different lab, different building in the university. And then at random intervals, he had a pager. The pager went off, and at those moments, he would send healing energy to those mice with cancer in only the experimental room, only the one room, not the other. The mice recovered from terminal cancer, for one thing. But the second thing was that the device measuring electromagnetism in the control group was just flat, just measuring random background electromagnetism. The device underneath the cage of the mice being healed fluctuated by up to 20% only at the random intervals when he was required to send healing to them and not other times. So our thoughts, our intentions, our energy can affect the outside world. So we live in this we are consciousness at our core, and we're consciousness in a body with a mind and with emotions. And so here we are as consciousness. Now, many people live their whole lives never developing a relationship with that greater consciousness. But there's some people who do. We all have glimpses of that greater consciousness throughout our lives. We'll look at a beautiful sunset. We will hold a friend and feel overwhelming love. We will read a movie's poetry and be blissed out. We'll dance, we'll hear music. All of us have these, Sufis call these glimpses of heaven. Every single being on the planet has glimpses of heaven. And those who are motivated then say, that felt really good. I think I'll go get some more. And so they meditate. They maybe learn to do more spiritual practices. They do things that connect them up with that consciousness. And now they're doing it regularly and often. Gradually, they become good at this. And so they develop a channel of communication, and then at some point they realize they are that consciousness that happens to be in a body and a mind and heart, and they live the rest of their lives that way. Those are the awakened people, and they are so inspiring. When you start to play with awakening and practice awakening, for a start, you start to attract other people to you who are awakened. I just happened to do a call today with a group I lead called the Awakeners. And they're people who've just committed to this and are doing this. And they're having remarkable transformative experiences in their lives as they are on this journey of awakening. For one thing, one of the characteristics of these awakened people is bliss. They are just incredibly happy. They have a sense of fundamental happiness, fundamental well-being. And again, we're researching them. We're doing empirical trials with them to see what happens in their brains and their bodies. Their brains start to change. Their corpus callosum, the brain tissue that connects the right and left hemisphere, starts to grow, and their right and left hemispheres now start to talk to each other more effectively. So now they're more creative as there's more effective communication between the left and right hemispheres. So their brains start to change, their genes start to change. The genes that code for the most pleasurable hormones and neurotransmitters like oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, anandamide, norepinephrine, all of these neurochemicals and the genes that code for them start to change. So now they're not just plugging into ecstasy every day in meditation. They aren't just sitting there on the couch and becoming one with the all that is, what Ramana Maharshi called the great stillness or the void. Ramana Maharshi was a great Indian teacher of the early 20th century. And so a lot of Westerners learned about non-duality and hooking up with consciousness through him and his teachings and people who learned with him. But they're doing this in the morning. The cool thing now we're finding, Yasmin, is we've been measuring for the last year. We're saying, okay, we know these people get super happy. They feel good. They have these gene changes. Their brains start to change. How nice for them. But what's going on when they get to work or they parent? And we've now the study is not published yet. It'll be being peer reviewed by a journal in the next month, and it'll go into publication next year. But we're finding that their level of happiness, for one thing, jumps by over 20% long term. Their level of transcendence, a sense of self-transcendence, the ability to transcend your own little self-preoccupied world, goes up by over 20%. And we found that their productivity when they get to work, or when they're working with a team, or when they're with their kids or their partners or their families, or they're in their family groups, their productivity rises over the course of the next year by 26%. They're now completing in 3 days what used to take them 4 days. And so they're becoming much more effective human beings as well as much happier ones. And this has never been done before. No one's ever tried to measure the productivity of awakened people. But it turns out that awakening makes you much happier and also makes you much more productive at work. So again, this effect starts to spread around you. And it is remarkable that in all these dimensions, we can measure this and we see how people are able to shift not only their internal reality, but the world around them.
Wow. I can definitely attest to that in my own life, like in terms of, the path of awakening and being much more productive, because you're also able to kind of manage your energy, right? And manage it and direct it in ways that are just much more efficient. I'm super curious about more studies on that because I think that would really transform the world. Every business, I think, would want their employees to be more
Yes.
awakened if that means more productive.
Oh, absolutely. And businesses should want this. They should want people who are happier and more productive. But they're also going to be more compassionate, and they're not going to be anything like ruthless or or playing blame or judgment games. So that that's going to change the culture of the workplace.
Right, right, absolutely. So in your book, you quote physicist Niels Bohr, and you say, if quantum mechanics, or you quote him saying, if quantum mechanics hasn't profoundly shocked you, you haven't understood it yet. Can you tell me what you think he meant by this?
The subatomic world is just seriously weird. I mean, think about quantum tunneling, where you have an electron being in two places at the same time, and then winking out of existence or waking out and waking back into existence. I mean, there's all kinds of things happening at the subatomic level that just make no sense with classical Newtonian physics. And then these phenomena that all the four forces of physics are affected by consciousness and by our consciousness. The most obvious way that's been measured now for well, about 200 years is the observer effect, is that photons and electrons behave differently when they're observed than when they're not observed. Uh, so that's showing us that the act of observation is able to change the material world down to the level of subatomic particles. So we're discovering these effects, and they really violate what we think of as the normal world of time and space. So as we get into this inquiry, we start to read about this research. We start to find out more about this. It often raises more questions than answers, but we don't need to know all of this to live happy lives. We just have to know that we are one with something larger than ourselves. What we're discovering now too is you don't want to just meditate and bliss out and feel good and have and move into this sense of being one with all that is. You want passion. In Bliss Brain, I looked at all of the factors that trigger positive neuroplastic change in the brain. And one of those is passion. Like read Rumi, read St. Catherine of Siena, St. Francis. I mean, they're writing Hafiz, they're writing in erotic, passionate terms about their connection with that non-local reality. And so if you have that kind of passion, it turns out this triggers brain change more quickly. And so we want to not just have sterile lives of sitting on a couch and trying to smile and feel good. We want passion. We want a sense of vibrant connection with that larger reality. This new field is called relational spirituality. Like I have a new course called a 21-day walk with your higher power. And what you do in that course is you have a direct relationship using some of the tools from Vedanta and Ramana Maharshi, but also from neuroscience. And neuroscience is letting us filter those tools and give people the most effective ones. And so people learn to have this passionate relationship with their higher power. And this again is turning on all those genes, turning on all those neurotransmitters, and shifting people really quickly. So this field is called relational spirituality. The newest research shows it changes gene expression, it changes brain function, and that passion turbocharges that connection. And suddenly you're channeling wisdom, you're channeling information, you're channeling inspiration from those greater realms into your daily life. And I've learned not to sweat too much about problems I have at work, in my nonprofit work. What I found is just meditate. And the answers will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and this knotty, difficult problem you could not solve at the level of your local mind, your local reality, suddenly you've been meditating and the answer just pops into your mind, and it's at a level of elegance you just couldn't have figured out at that level of your everyday mind. So this is why. I mean, Einstein, for example, got his theory of relativity in a dream, and he said that every great scientific discovery has been made in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And so you might download music or poetry or architecture or education. Who knows what you might do if you are making space, making time every day for that connection with non-local mind, with all of consciousness. And you're not just bringing an insipid, tepid approach to it. You are bringing all the passion of a St. Francis or a St. Teresa or a Rumi. Just absolutely move into that space with all the passion you possibly can. In one chapter of Bliss Brain, I have a comparison of the neurochemicals you produce in these states with a comparison of the chemicals your body produces during a sexual orgasm, and they're almost identical to each other. So have orgasmic orgasmic meditations, orgasmic spirituality.
I love that. Okay, amazing. So, to kind of tap into that passion state is you just get there through your meditative technique with using all these different modalities, correct?
That's how I do it. Just again, stacking this heart coherence, tapping, mindfulness, self hypnosis. These we call the package eco meditation, and it's been all over the web for 10. I put it up free on the web about 10 years ago. It's all over the place. Coaches are using it. A lot of well-known biohackers are using it. Eco meditation is just all over now. There are tons of tracks you can download free. Besides the ones from my site.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, we'll include that in the show notes. And looking back, Dawson, I know we're coming at time. What sort of things have surprised you the most on this journey?
Well, one of the curious things that we discover when we ask people who have had awakening experiences and that have changed their lives is, do you regret that this only happened to you when you were X years old? Don't you wish it happened to you when you were half X? Like if it happened to you when you were 40, don't you wish it had happened to you when you were 20? So you could have lived 20 more years in this sort of ecstasy. And the very interesting answer we get, Yasmin, in our research is no.
Hmm.
People don't mind that they awakened to that sense of oneness at 40 or 60 or even 80. People go there when they're 80 or 85 years old and they're completely at peace with their lives the way they are. And I'm completely at peace with my life the way it is. And I look back and there are so many things I, at one level, wish I'd done differently. I did things that were not, that were just out of not knowing how the way the world worked. And so I look back and think, do I want this differently? Would I rather my life had been different? And what you realize is your life, the way it was in the past, however imperfect it was, brought you to the moment you're at now, the moment you can awaken, the moment you can move into oneness. And so it's perfect the way it is. So people have this fundamental sense of perfection about their lives, exactly the way they were. And that's been a surprise to me. Um, the other thing is how much people can change. You can change, and you're likely to change if you start doing this work. Like I have a new course called The Short Path to Oneness, and we're actually mentoring people on a 9-month journey using all these non-duality exercises. And we're encouraging them to keep a journal. And we know from the developmental stages we take them through over 9 months, they are likely to change radically. These awakeners are going to be completely different people after 9 months. A couple of them were saying on today's call, one of the side effects of this is that your marriage partner, your husband, your wife becomes much nicer to you. And then they just laughed because, of course, they know that their husband or wife who's not in the Awakeners group didn't probably change very much. They changed, and so you change, and so people with these difficult marriages suddenly discover they're easy and pleasurable marriages, and so all of these, the number of the scale of things that change around you, that's a surprise, and the fact that your brain is changing. I mean, think about what I'm saying here is that the brain is literally changing. The corpus callosum gets bigger, the center of the brain that is responsible for suffering, the mid-prefrontal cortex that starts to become less active, the insula that governs all the pleasure emotions, all the positive emotions like compassion, gratitude, joy, awe, that becomes more active. And so what people don't realize is the fact that our brain anatomy changes means that we can, if we're doing this consciously and taking control of our lives and our activities and our thoughts and our emotions, we're changing our brains and we're becoming a whole different person. And I don't think we've yet grasped how profound that is, because no other species on Earth ever has had the superpower of changing the anatomy of its brain and not doing it over like 50 generations, like in Darwinian time. We're doing this, we can do this within a month, 2 months. We're seeing significant brain change. So I think that's the big surprise. And I think we're now starting to realize in science that this phenomenon called neural plasticity has potentially radical ramifications for individuals and for society. So I think those are some of the big surprises to me, the big aha moments for me in the last while. And I wrote Bliss Brain after I wrote it in the months after a shattering personal tragedy. I was shaken awake one morning, one early one morning by my wife. It was 12:45 a.m. I looked at the alarm clock. It was blinking 12:45. I looked out the window. There was a yellow glow on the horizon. I ran outside, and there was a massive wildfire moving toward our house in Northern California. And it reached the house just as we literally ran through the house, grabbing our phones, throwing on clothes, and sprinting for the car and driving out through the flames. And that night, we lost everything. We lost our home, we lost our office, we lost literally all our possessions except for that car and our phones. And so 5,400 homes were destroyed in that fire that night. And we had a couple of years of just chaos. And I'd meditate in the morning after the fire. Now, we were definitely affected. I mean, we had all the symptoms of PTSD. We were having nightmares and flashbacks. I was waking up at 12:45 a.m. every night. So I needed treatment. I needed talented therapists working on me, a lot of energy work, a lot of tapping. But in the months afterwards, as we were meditating, I realized I was sitting there in a rented house, wearing borrowed clothes, without any money. We'd lost all of our savings as well. And I realized I was absolutely blissfully happy. And I thought, this is completely weird. Why, after losing absolutely all my possessions and almost losing my life, should I be this happy? So I began to dig into the neuroscience of this. And that's when I wrote Bliss Brain. So we can have these experiences and still be happy. And I wrote the book to try to explain why. How can you have a shattering divorce, shattering loss, shattering event in your life and still retain your equilibrium? And the subtitle is The Neuroscience of Remodeling Our Brains for Creativity, Resilience, and Joy. And how can you be so happy when you have nothing? This doesn't make any sense to the logical mind. I better write a book to explain this one.
Wow.
So I did.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that story. Wow, that's powerful. And a reminder that, that if you change your brain, then it doesn't actually really matter what's going on in your external world. That's such a powerful example. Dawson, thank you so much for your time and for all the books that you have written and all the future books that are coming down the pipeline. And what do you want to tell our listeners as a main takeaway? What's like your call to action for people listening? What do you want them to do right now?
I want them to meditate daily. Just commit to daily meditation. That one thing is going to produce shifts. I want you to tap and release your stress during the day. So meditation's for the morning when you set the frame for your life. Do that. Just jump in. Don't say I'll do it on the weekend when I have time. Set your alarm clock half an hour early tomorrow and just do it. Just get off the procrastination horse and just meditate. That's the one thing. The second thing is when you're stressed during the day, later on, tap. Tapping is going to rapidly release your stress. And so those are the two things you do. Those are the actions you take. And what you have to realize is that we're measuring people doing these things over time. And we're finding that they have they have levels of happiness, Yasmin, that are inconceivable to the average person. Like their brain chemistry and their brain waves show that they are 10 times as happy as the happiest average person. They're just out there at levels of bliss the average person can't even imagine. And that is accessible to everyone. We all have these circuits in our brain. We all have brains that'll do this. We've just got to stop being in stress. We've got to stop our old patterns, and we have to start using what I call in Bliss Brain, I call it the enlightenment network. It's right there sitting in everyone's brain. And for most people, they live and die and hardly ever turn it on. And the stress network is predominant instead. So I want people to realize that you are able to get happy at a level which you now cannot even imagine. And it doesn't take long and it doesn't take much effort, but it does take that 30 minutes of meditation in the morning, and it does take that tapping when you're stressed during the day. And once you do that, your entire life is going to start to change. You will create things you never created before. You will be resilient where when your house burns down, which I hope you will not do, but we all have stuff going on in our lives, whether it's a child who's not doing well or a sick person or somebody dies or the economy. Just have these tools, practice them, have that resilient brain, love yourself enough to do this, and then see your life change and be one of those lights, one of those beings, those agents of emotional contagion all around you. You can change the world.
Dawson, thank you so very much. This was so inspiring. Are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about your work? Where can we find your work?
Well, you'll get both Eco Meditation and the EFT mini manual at my website, Tapping, just like tapping with your fingertips, that kind of tapping, gift, GIFT, tappinggift.com. You can both get the EFT mini manual there, and you can also get a free eco meditation. We have a lot of other resources too. We have an app called Stress Solution where you can do live one-on-one sessions with a certified practitioner whenever you're stressed. We have a lot of classes and other resources, online courses available through tappinggift.com. But go there first, and you can also download the Stress Solution app and just start using these resources, and you'll be guided after that to whatever your highest, best next step is.
Wow, amazing. Okay, great. So thank you so much again, Dawson. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about why your thought quality matters more than you think and why EFT is so important with Dawson Church. And you can tune into Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.